Okay, good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Finding Warmth for Our Son. I'm Matthew Browngan, your host here. I just got my first dose of vaccine, so it's pretty exciting, particularly since I have this year I've been in the process of being diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, and it's been some things. A friend of mine commented on how I look good. I ain't feeling good. My body, it's been a rough one on my body. But if you have immunocompromised or one of those conditions, go out. Any health conditions, go out, get vaxxed. Hopefully, it'll broaden up soon for everybody. Anyways, thanks for coming to Finding Warmth for Our Son. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Madison365. You can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Please hit subscribe, share, do all that stuff, particularly if you, of course, if you like it. Anyways, but thanks for coming. So it's going to be kind of in a little bit of the same series as some of the stuff about cancel culture, but this is specifically within the context of some of the voting suppression laws that are on the books. So one just got passed down in Georgia. But the Brennan Center for Justice found that it said in the backlash, particularly to the historic turnout in the 2020 general election, grounded in a rash of baseless and racist allegations of voter fraud and election irregularities, legislatures have introduced well over 4 times the number of bills to restrict voting access as compared to roughly this time last year. 33 states have introduced pre-filed or carried over 165 restrictive bills this year. That's a lot. And it's mostly a GOP states. It's very much voter suppression. This is Jim Crow 2.0. It's that blatant. Georgia particularly is troublesome, and they've made it so that they're basically local electorates, those that certify elections, are pretty much 100% partisan. And if they don't like the outcome, they have the capability now to legally, within the state of Georgia, overturn the results. Very undemocratic, and have stripped the power of the Republican Attorney General, which they felt didn't show fealty to Trump. So Matt Walsh, a fascist and neo-Confederate apologist, tweeted in relation to the Georgia voting laws his thoughts to this, that this is a good start. We need laws that will prevent many more people from voting. A huge swath of the electorate has no business in voting booth. Testing and other requirements could weed out the most unfit. Straight out of Jim Crow. Straight out of Jim Crow. And he's saying this openly without a hint of sarcasm, a hint of irony, anything. And of course, he pulls these ideas and tries to say that they weren't racist. He tries to say that those that accuse him of being racist are the real racists. Again, this is straight out of the Jim Crow playbook that says those that accuse somebody of being racist are the real racists. He said, every time I argue that uninformed voters should be weeded out with testing, I'm accused of racism. But if you call that racist, what you're saying is that you think minorities are uninformed. That's not my view. It's yours. You're the bigot. My focus isn't race, it's competency. Every time I argue that uninformed voters should be weeded out with testing, I'm accused of racism. It keeps going on. Again, straight out of the conservative playbook, particularly when it comes to race. This idea that, particularly in their attacks on affirmative action, they say, well, why hire a black person for this job? I'm trying to hire the most competent, which then directly implies that if you hire a black person, they're not going to be competent. And the reason why these positions are filled with mostly white people, particularly mostly white men, is they're the most competent. You have to lower your standards to bring black people in or women in. Very, very rooted in that. But this goes beyond the GOP's want to roll back really voting rights. They want to roll back any advancement, even cosmetic ones, that were gained from the Civil Rights Movement, which was incomplete. The Civil Rights Movement was very much incomplete in the gains. let's think about this for a second. And how is it incomplete for its gains? Did senators, bankers, CEOs that advocated for segregation, were they removed from power? Was power changed and massive resources infused in Black American communities that were often left out? No, they weren't. Okay, and this kind of connects further, and we'll work through this. So just as really a GOP has worked for generations, I should say more so the conservatives and real conservative movements, to work through generations to roll back the New Deal, they're now attempting to crush the gains from the civil rights movement. And they repealed the New Deal. Reagan was the stone in this coffin. But again, the gains of the civil rights movement is overstated to begin with. And this part's important, especially for anyone who has felt that Black radicals have been too critical of Democrats, white liberals, and moderates for them to adequately support Black liberation. We'll kind of work through this. And there's an important aspect to what's going on in the GOP and the cover that the media and particularly moderate Dems have given them. And they've almost given them a legitimacy in this two sides. So they've left out the New Deal. And part of this is particularly important. Since the New Deal left out a lot of initiatives for Black folks. It did a lot at the same time, and it set up a progressive run of racial politics. It helped infuse the budding civil rights movement with energy, because there was things that helped uplift Black America within it. Well, at the same time, Black Americans have left out some of its most impactful initiatives. And then they push that kind of promise to uplift even further. But we also must recognize racial politics, really white identity politics the GOP has used over 30 plus years to help roll back the New Deal gains. This started with the Southern strategy to pull whites over to their cause, to strip down the gains of the New Deal, breaking labor unions, privatization of public initiatives, particularly education, tax cuts for the rich, deregulation, and more. Privatization for education and charter schools and vouchers. This stuff was born out of particularly white conservatives wanting to go to segregated schools and segregated neighborhoods. White nationalist politics has been the GOP's politics since Democrats embraced, at least partially, the civil rights movement, because it was never fully. And there's a sad aspect to this. Some white liberals and so-called moderates, they've given them cover. These folks have embraced criticisms of so-called cancel culture, far more than they've criticized actions from the right of voter suppression and anti-democratic behavior and the coup attempt and full-bore white nationalism. They embrace ideas that call for justice and accountability against oppressors, that label those that call for justice and accountability against oppressors as authoritarian. They try to call, and even I've seen white moderates label some of this stuff as the new McCarthyism. And they, again, are more concerned about the potential of this being authoritarian than actual authoritarians who stormed the Capitol and the elected reps who have leading the way and challenging the very notion of democracy. In fact, white liberals in law schools accepted the right-wing view of colorblindness, one that many Black scholars and law school scholars rejected. And this was partly why critical race theory was adopted. They felt that race was a central aspect to law, to the foundations and institutions of the United States, that it is absolutely essential to how things run. Law isn't colorblind. The people and judges and even how things were written, it's not a colorblind or race neutral type of endeavor. In fact, it was one of the first race laws created part of legalize or create the legal aspect of whiteness. one of the Virginia slave codes wrote into law whiteness and blackness was in relation to slavery, to being enslaved. Also, this is much of the press is doing this too. Notice how they've embraced GOP talking points about the so-called border crisis, while not seeing this as a general yearly influx that it very much is. And the fact that it's marginally lower than the so-called flux that Trump had. And the fact that what Trump was doing was illegal, as well as a crime against humanity. He also left Biden with zero infrastructure to actually process people coming to the border. Now, there's a lot to criticize about Biden and his immigration policies, because he's kept actually a lot of Trump's immigration policies intact so far. But him not sending away people illegally isn't one of them. And labeling this a crisis isn't one of them. But then again, this type of behavior by the GOP, this drummed up conflict, this drummed up outrage, such as to Dr. Seuss' estate, pulling a few books from publishing that were obviously racist. You can still find them in the library, and big deal. It evolved, and other cultural war issues are not being criticized by the media or moderates and even some white liberals. At least not to the extent that they call out the so-called, cancel culture left and leftist elites, which is funny because, again, critical race theory and stuff that you would label as cancel culture oftentimes is coming from very oppressed people and oppressed groups wanting accountability. It's quite comical to label anti-racist behavior as a liberal elite phenomenon. So we'll put those that advocating for social justice causes on the left, again, as those taking part in the culture war, and that those issues aren't bread and butter issues. This helps give cover to the GOP dismantling the civil rights movement. It's a retelling or a laundering of the idea of what the GOP says when they say real Americans. When you say issues of social justice, issues of justice aren't bread and butter issues, aren't health and economic issues, aren't environmental issues. That is laundering the idea of what a real, so-called real American is. It re-emphasizes and centers whiteness in that only the white identity and white identity issues or an erasing of issues that impact Black and brown Americans, that we aren't real Americans. I mean, it's comical and outrageous that is, but we see moderates doing that. And not calling, our criminal justice system impacts Black and brown families in a real economic way. Policing reform impacts Black and brown families in a real economic way. Disparities in healthcare impact Black and brown families in a real economic way. Again, access to abortion and body autonomy is an economic issue and a healthcare issue. But just because it doesn't impact or at least seemingly impact white men, it's not a bread and butter issue. And it also dismisses, again, the idea of issues that Black and brown people and women uphold as important to them aren't real issues to be concerned about. These are the very same ideas the GOP use to dismiss issues of social justice. They say that the Dems who support these issues don't support real America, working class America, but they mean white. So what are you doing if you're laundering these things and repeating their talking points? That these aren't, the GOP party is the party of white nationalists. What are you doing? And it also helps deny good governance when you launder these talking points. Because then they can, it helps them use more and more dog whistle politics, particularly against economic relief packages and infrastructure packages and other things that must be done. There are also bread and butter, but infrastructure Transportation infrastructure is also a social justice issue, an environmental justice issue. How are the highways built? They're built through Black neighborhoods, destroying many Black neighborhoods, destroying many Black businesses. That's an economic issue, and a race issue, and a transportation issue. It's bread and butter for Black Americans. And these issues are issues of the Democratic Party as well. It's a multicultural coalition. And the GOP is, as you see folks calling these, the entire Democratic Party as un-American. And really the point being is that their entire party is one of white nationalism. That if you do embrace the Multicultural Coalition, this nation will break apart. And I'm sorry, moderates, you can't out-racist the GOP. You can't out-dog whistle the GOP. All you're going to do is continue to push away Black and brown Americans. And I'll explore the 2020 election, I think next week, and the numbers, because there's a mirage there in the numbers, such as the rise in Black male voters for Donald Trump, which actually was a rise compared to Obama particularly, but Obama is actually much more of an outlier. The rise of Black male voters to Donald Trump is well within the last 30, 40-year average of GOP voters for in presidential elections, of Black male voters voting for GOP president. It's not outside the norm. Obama was outside the norm. The 2020 election wasn't outside the norm. The assumption was that Obama created a new norm. But again, that's complicated and then also kind of subtly racist in that it's an implication that Black voters are a monolith. But again, that's a sidetrack, and we'll dive a bit deeper to that in a different time. So let's actually look at some of the words of what they think of Democrats and why this is important that moderates don't launder their anti-democratic, their anti-civil rights, and wanting to roll back these civil rights stuff. They're very much the party of white nationalists. Glenn Elmers from American Mind, published from the Claremont Institute, said, "Let's be blunt. The United States has become two nations occupying the same country. When pressed or in private, many would argue now, or would agree, when pressed or in private, many would admit as much. Fewer are willing to take the next step and accept that most people living in the United States today, certainly more than half, are not Americans in any meaningful sense of the term." What about those who do consider themselves Americans? By and large, I'm referring to 75 million people who voted in the last election against the senile figurehead of the party who stands for mob violence, ruthless censorship, and racial grievances, not to mention bureaucratic despotism. Regardless of Trump's obvious flaws, preferring his re-election was not a difficult choice for those voters. In fact, leaving aside the Republican never-Trumpers and some squeamish centrists, it was not a difficult choice for either side. Both right and left knew where they stand today, and it is not together, not anymore. This idea, again, the real Americans, who are mostly those 75 million people, mostly white people. It's mostly rejecting the idea of a multicultural democracy. And again, let's the mob violence and censorship and racial grievances. We hear moderates use that language as well. Laundering these ideas, giving credence to these ideas, and giving cover to the GOP and wanting to return to the Jim Crow era. That is dangerous. They want to continue to roll us back, and we can't give cover to them. We have to attack them for what they are, the party of white nationalists. But this has been a pattern behavior with white nationalists, perpetuating radical behavior and white moderates acquiescing to their demands. The Civil War and Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, were only the times that this didn't happen. But those were unfulfilled dreams. And when we had a chance to really upturn the power systems and hold racists accountable, white moderates relented. Again, when was anybody held accountable for pushing for a white nationalist nation, for seceding from the country? How many traitors were hung? There's barely any accountability for those that committed treason against the United States. Many of the same men who supported it ended up becoming government officials, CEOs, and entrepreneurs, and made a lot of wealth, continue to make wealth in the country. What bank execs and corporate execs and senators who supported segregation, some senators and in Congress, in those times we know, actually were part of the KKK, committed lynchings, broke the law. How many were left in their positions of power? Well, all of them. We never let those who built racist institutions face the consequences for doing such, let alone deconstruct these institutions. Whites fleeing to the suburbs to recreate all-white schools were allowed to do so because of racist lending practices and highways built through black neighborhoods. And many times moderates push for these things. But this is a danger of these times. The GOP is going full authoritarian and white nationalists, pushing for Jim Crow 2.0. Will many give them cover, again, laundering their views? Many aren't alarmed enough. Many of us aren't nearly as alarmed as we should be. The actions to take to push Democratic senators to abolish a filibuster, to fund local get-out-the-vote efforts, organizations that do this across the nation. We have to do these things. We have to push it back against their harmful narratives. Wokeness and cancel culture, those narratives that they push are part of that. We can't we can't let those voices win out. Really, the only way forward is for us to embrace the idea of a multicultural democracy. It is to challenge. It is challenging as it ends up being really a question about power, and to challenge yourself, especially if you're white, about this, about what it means to give up certain types of power. And it's also a challenging of the myths of America. We must continue to call the GOP what they are, clearly what they're doing, and hold them accountable. We can't shy away from any of this. And I want to quickly dive, just to wrap up a little bit deeper on why I'm combining moderates in this and their take-up of colorblind, countercultural issues and wokeness, because they are impeding progress by giving cover to the GOP and their white nationalist talking points, by pointing the finger at an authoritarianism that isn't there, all right, and by ignoring the authoritarianism that is there, that looks to override democracy. It's dangerous. By being more critical of those that say we shouldn't tolerate racists in position of power than the racists in power, that's dangerous. You give credibility to their talking points. They are a real threat to the fabric of the nation. Maybe these moderates should worry more about the white folks that feel and feel that ideas of justice mean that it's legitimate to embrace white supremacy and white nationalism. That would rather reject those ideas and then embrace white nationalism. If you look around at all the people talking about race and racism that are similar to you, and a lot of them are coming from the party of white nationalists, not black organized or radical thinkers, then you have a lot of thinking to do. For example, Tucker Carlson has talked at lengths about wokeness and cancel culture, and in fact has, the U.S. military is examining white supremacists in its ranks. Carlson says, again, use that as to say the military is caught up in the cultural revolution of wokeness. A libertarian-based foundation, the Foundation for Economic Education, has written at lengths about bringing identity politics and courses on race and wokeness and more into the classroom, with broad definitions of critical race theory and more. But it really just boils down to them being, objecting to the ideas of teaching history of race and racism. CPAC had an entire conference on countercultural and wokeness this past year, where Congressman Madison Cawthorn, who is a Hitler fan, said liberals want to set up indoctrination camps within the context of cancel culture and wokeness, like really kind of, within the cancel culture of wokeness. Governor Rick Scott complained about woke athletes kneeling for the anthem. National Post, quite conservative national Canadian paper on wokeness, said politics for some people today is what fundamentalist religions were in the days past, a field of doctrines and dogmas, along with punishment and secular hellfire for those who do not believe. Politics, especially from the high liberal or woke perspective, is a call something close to an actual order to agree with a set of opinions on certain subjects that are handed down from above. On these matters, politics is not a call for debate, and certainly not one for compromise. To oppose or dissent on these topics is seen as moral failure, and similarly leads to accusations that the dissenter is racist or a denier, these being the favorite terms of what passes for rebuttal. It's not far what I've seen some moderates write. And the Conservative Heritage Foundation has published things over and over on wokeness and cancel culture. Another person said, for those of us in media, there's a real challenge to confront, he said, a wave of censorship that seeks to silence conversation, to stifle debate, and ultimately stop individuals and societies from realizing their potential. They went on to say, rigidly enforced conformity, aided and embedded by so-called social media, is a straitjacket on sensibility. This was in the context of wokeness and cancel culture. You know who said that? Rupert Murdoch. And locally, David Blaska has been the champion of anti-wokeness and colorblindness and blasts so-called cancel culture all over the place. Actually, you can go on his blog and read his views on race. And if you see your views reflected, your opinion, you need some self-reflection. And in fact, David Blaska, if he champions your views on race and colorblindness and critical race theory, and you call yourself a moderate or a Democrat, you need to reflect that too. So I have to wrap up and say, again, if you look around at the other people talking about race and racism, most similar to you, and these people are coming from the party of the white nationalists, and you disagree more with black organizers, radicals, and thinkers about race and racism in this country, and you agree more with the party of white nationalists, then you have to ask yourself why you're in company with these white nationalists and white supremacists and not with the black thinkers. You need to reflect on why you're surrounded by mostly white people in agreement with you and not black and brown people on issues of race. Because it becomes hard. We are in a real fight and we need everybody at hand. And many of these white moderates and some of these white liberals are hurdles to this and would rather target black thinkers and radicals than real threats to democracy, such as what's going down in Georgia. And all these things are tied together. They really, really are. The media is doing this too by laundering these views and painting the fight for voting rights as a both sides issue, that somehow the GOP has a legitimate concern and a legitimate viewpoint. Moderates help do this too. If you stepped out and said this is not legitimate and engaged earnestly with what is going on in the GOP, particularly out in the press, particularly on TV, you might have a different narrative coming about. But this is a massive, massive fight. And it's quite tiring when there are people that claim they're against racism and for justice, but perpetually argue talking points that many times are indistinguishable from the GOP. We can't fight you two and come out on this on the other side. So you need to reflect and figure this out, because this is real stuff. We need HR 1 passed. We need voting rights passed nationally. We need to get rid of the filibuster to do this. As long as we have moderates taking up these talking points, it'll be extremely difficult for us to do this. That is it for this week on Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Barlin, your host. Thanks for coming. Again, if you can go vaccine, do that. But you can find us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Please subscribe, listen, share with your people if there's anything interesting that you'll like. Stay safe and mask up. And this next coming week, it's going to be starting getting warm in the weekend. So, start enjoying the warm weather. Thanks, folks, and have a good one.
This is 365 Media.